unleashing female power.
Being a disruptor.
I'm always constantly telling the truth.
I love
art. That's all her life.
She's alive and female.
Being a woman, what it meant.
Prove him wrong.
Girls run the world.
We're rocking the place.
Welcome to the Art Pod. I'm your host, Carolina, and I'll be your guide through this Pandora's box. Strap yourselves in for a journey through the art world where we bring you candid conversations, untold stories, uncover industry secrets, and celebrate the women who are shaping its future. Because in the Art Pod, the spotlight is always on the girls. Hi, everybody, and welcome to another episode of the Art Pod. My guest today is Aki Carpenter. Welcome.
Thank you. Excited to be here.
So a little bit about Aki. She is, as RAA's Global Vice President and Chief Creative Officer, Aki provides vision and oversees creative direction and output, including providing guidance and feedback on projects and ensuring that the company's design work aligns with the practices brand, objectives, and principles. She is a lead voice of planning and design inside and outside the firm, articulating its vision, sharing the work, and promoting holistic thinking about making public spaces for learning. She has opened over 10 award-winning museums and cultural institutions worldwide. Aki's current work at RAA includes leading the exhibition design for the museum at the Obama Presidential Center in Chicago, the National Underground Railroad Freedom Center in Cincinnati, the Japanese American National Museum in Los Angeles, and advising the International Slavery Museum and Maritime Museum in Liverpool, in the UK. Her most recently opened projects include creative direction for the exhibition and graphic design for the National Museum of African American History and Culture in Washington, D.C., and the International African American Museum in Charleston. Aki's passion and experience is dedicated to the development of national and international cultural institutions with a focus on issue and mission-based projects. Many of her projects address topics of social justice, activism, and community. Aki is co-founder of the BIPOC Directors Collective, an initiative by directors of color for fellow and future directors of color. She is also a founding member and creative director for Ripple Effect, a New Orleans-based environmental education startup dedicated to K-12 education about socio-ecological issues of climate change. Let's maybe begin, because it's a lot to go through. Let's maybe begin with you are currently the Vice President and Chief Creative Officer at RAA, which is Ralph Applebaum Associates, where you have been for nearly 2 decades. Mm-hmm. Can you tell us a little bit about RAA?
Of course. I always get so much when you're reading the bio. Let's see. How do I start with Ralph Applebaum Associates? All right. So RAA is a museum exhibition and narrative environment design studio. We're a practice that is multidisciplinary. Our studio is comprised of a lot of different talented people. We have everyone from architects and sort of interior architecture, interior design folks, visual designers or graphic designers who are often coming from, let's say, more editorial design or branding design, really people who think about communicating story. Really importantly, we have our content development discipline, and they're coming from areas of scholarship or research or just really good kind of content designers. And then, of course, we have our media arm, who looks at kind of linear and interactive media. I'm noting all those disciplines because the work that we do, working with cultural institutions and museums worldwide, is we're thinking about how do we tell story in space. So it really takes a lot of different kind of design thinking and storytelling thinking to shape an experience within architecture. We have, we're coming close to 50-year practice. Wow. We're one of the largest studios in the world that's dedicated to exhibition design. Right now, I think we have over 80 live projects worldwide. They range from, I think maybe what we're more well known for, which are sort of ground up, large new institutions. We're working really closely with the institution, their sort of knowledge scholarship, but also working with the architects and a really, really large team to bring these projects to life. But I always want to underscore that is not, just the core of our work. We work on a real range of projects. We work really importantly with smaller scale projects that can be equally as complex and absolutely equally as important as the larger projects that we're known for. But really, we're thinking about what is the role of a museum? How is history told there? How is it connected to today? And how will visitors kind of be more mindful of the world around them when they leave with all this new information that they've learned in these spaces?
Yeah. When my visitors tell me they've been somewhere, when my guests tell me that they've been somewhere for that long, I'm like, wow, you must really love the place that you work at and your job. So maybe let's jump into a little bit about what your main responsibilities and your days kind of look like there.
Sure. Yeah. I think, being there almost 2 decades, I've had a lot of different roles.
Yeah.
And exactly to what you're saying, I think as a young designer, you don't think that you're going to be somewhere for close to 2 decades. But I love the work. I really love diving into different subject matters. I love the mission-driven aspects of these institutions that we get to uplift, and the kind of shelf life of the content. So for me, my role has evolved over the course of 2 decades. But right now, in my role of vice president and chief creative officer, I'm kind of playing 2 big roles for the global practice. Vice president, I'm really thinking about, we're in a new era of leadership within the practice. Ralph Applebaum founded the studio based out of New York and eventually became a global practice. His son, Nick Applebaum, and I are now kind continuing that work. We don't say that Ralph has, retired. He's still, I speak with him once a week, but we really are kind of shepherding the future of the practice at this point. So as vice president, I'm looking over the kind of future of the practice, thinking about what's next for us. But I would say what I've really honed in on is sort of, especially post-pandemic, that kind of creative connection that we can have across our global studios, sharing of expertise, thinking about how we activate our network of clients, develop best practices, and really look at things across a company and in terms of policy, and how we function as a business. And then in the chief creative officer role, I'm really looking over the portfolio of the practice. So while I haven't, and I will never sort of let go of being in projects, I love still sketching and thinking about the conceptual ideation of some of the projects within our office that I'm more, I would say, in the day-to-day of with the clients and the teams. I'm also kind of touching in with other projects across all the offices to think about and be part of those creative conversations.
It's always fascinated me how creatives begin to talk and approach projects, especially when it comes to design and branding and, storytelling. Can you talk a little bit more about how you begin to kind of craft the story for an institution? How do you approach it?
Yeah. That is, I would say, our first step. I mean, there's first steps in terms of process and sort of learning from the client. I often call it the discovery or hard listening phase. And that's when we're really kind of give us everything. We deep dive into every single subject matter that each of these museums represent. But to your question, I think the first kind of big step in the creative methodology is defining what we call the visitor journey. And that's essentially sort of the key message that will be experienced spatially throughout the exhibit. So, for example, one of my last major projects was the National Museum of African American History and Culture on the Mall in DC. And that was working with a trio of architects for a brand new building on the Mall. And the design of it, which was by art design architect David Adjei, was sort of this volume that was modeled after a Yoruba African sculpture that was sort of this uplifting shape. And so the idea was really, how are we going to tell a story that's ascending through this architecture? And the way we ended up working with the curators and organizing the content was really to put history in the lower levels. We actually dug down 60 feet into the earth to create this volume underground. And as they ascended through the building, they would then go to the community level, where they would learn about subject matters like sports and military, and then looking at sort of distinct areas across the United States in a gallery called Power of Place. And then they would rise to the community or the culture level as the final level in their visitor journey. All of that we kind of distilled down into what is that kind of major takeaway, that first step, and how do people understand how they're experiencing this museum? And we came up with sort of essentially an elevator pitch tagline for that experience, which is visitors will be rooted in history in the lower levels. They will rise to embrace community on the third level, and then celebrate culture on the fourth level. Once we establish a visitor journey or visitor arc like that, then we really start beginning figuring out how the story kind of folds into that. And then we go deeper and deeper from there.
Wow, yeah, that's you're really constructing that story and that experience for the visitors, which is really incredible. So we talked a little bit about your kind of responsibilities in your role, and you talked a little bit about the fact that you kind of had a progression at RAA because you began as a visual designer. And then throughout the years, you were an art director, a creative director, project director, associate. Can you talk a little bit about what initially attracted you to working for RAA?
Sure. Let's see. So I majored in communications design, meaning visual design, graphic design. How do you communicate messages? How do you kind of deliver complex information in a way that's understandable and accessible? And I was working in a space that was really looking at kind of lifestyle and had a very different, as I said, sort of shelf life than what I do now. And back in the day, you applied for like every single job on Craigslist. You were really like sorting through different magazines to find what the opportunities were. And I had actually applied for a job in exhibition design. And at the time, it didn't sound particularly exactly what I wanted to do. It sounded sort of like creating labels, and I didn't exactly know what that meant. I think design is a historically kind of non-diverse space. It wasn't a place that I was really familiar with. I wasn't a student who came into the design space having a lot of exposure to it. So I was constantly learning and trying to understand sort of what is an art director, what is a creative director, what are all these different spaces. When I got a response to that application, all of a sudden, I don't know what had happened in those few months between when I had applied and when I accepted the role, but all of a sudden it sounded like the most interesting job. I think this like education in public space and learning in public space sounded really, really interesting to me at that point. So when I joined as a visual designer, I was suddenly exposed to this multidisciplinary way of working and way of thinking as a designer, and having that overlap with all different types of design thinking, whether it be architecture or sort of storytelling, media. I also at RAA, realized that some projects had let's say like more resources, bigger networks. They were tied to larger institutions with bigger foundations. And so the way of thinking of planning and creating projects was much more exciting, because I realized even then as a young designer that I loved thinking holistically. I loved thinking sort of long-term, and thinking really strategically about how these projects take shape and how the conceptual development kind of manifests, and ultimately how it's sort of produced and delivered to the visitor. All of that type of design thinking was really new to me, because the types of design I had been doing as a young graphic designer were much smaller in scale, had much less impact. As lovely as they were, I think the ambition and the scale and the importance and sort of the gravity around the work of exhibition design was, and I just fell in love really quickly.
Yeah. Can you tell us a little bit about what exhibition design actually is? Because I think most people tend to just walk into a museum and be like, okay, this person curated the exhibition, they put the paintings up on the wall, and that's it. So I want to really get into the nitty-gritty of actually defining what exhibition design is.
I appreciate that. And I think there's, there's genres within exhibition design, but it's funny because when I say I work in exhibition design, people immediately think I'm an architect or a curator, or they think I, hang fine art on walls,
Yeah.
which, I mean, fine art is a huge source of inspiration for me. So I don't necessarily take that in any kind of bad way. But the only way I can describe it is, just to root you in sort of my thinking around that is when I grew up going to museums. My family traveled to museums a lot. We weren't really like beach destination vacation families.
Totally get it, because neither am I.
But even then as a young person, you kind of think that museums just kind of poof appear. You don't think about all of the work that goes into it.
Yeah.
And frankly, like in my early years in school, I wasn't exposed to that either. So I was constantly becoming more and more aware of how these places are made and who's making them. In the area of exhibition design that I work in, it's really about working with an institution that has a, let's say, dedication to the research, the preservation, and the presentation of scholarship and collections that's within their institution. And we as exhibit designers think about immersive, spatial, experiential ways of understanding that story. We often talk about it as learning in public. That's really important to exhibition designers, because I think being in a space with someone else and kind of being in dialogue with the history in present day is something we think a lot about when we're developing the exhibitions. But what we're doing is we're working with the curators. We're looking at their collections, working with their archivists. We're understanding what I call the kind of major beats of the story. Mm-hmm. And then we're working with the architects to say, okay, here's some ideas around how we can tell the story spatially, meaning through architectural interventions, through lighting, through sound, through, very importantly, the placement of their collections, their artifacts, or in the instance of museums that maybe are more of a less of a collections forward institution, the main driver for us is how does that narrative flow through architecture and how is it delivered, whether it's graphics, text, media, collections, or any new and surprising kind of formats.
Yeah, thank you for describing that, because I feel like a lot of people don't actually know that a lot of the exhibitions that they actually go to see have been designed for them. Mm-hmm. So talking a little bit about your projects, because you've mentioned the African American Museum briefly. You work on many projects that address topics of social justice and community. You've worked on International African Museum that you just mentioned, and the National Museum of African American History and Culture. Can you tell us a little bit about these sorts of projects, the social justice and community type based projects?
Of course. Yeah. First off, I have to say I'm one of many.
Okay.
I think there are, to create these projects truly takes a village. So I think even for the National Museum of African American History and Culture in DC, I think at one point we counted between the architecture, project management, all of REA, we were like over 400 people.
Wow.
Just to create these projects. And I say that because it's really important to me that everyone knows how many people, like how hard and rewarding these projects are to create. The kind of social value of these projects that I have had the honor of working on over the course of my career is incredibly important to me. It's sort of why I've stayed in the field, especially today when I think these histories, like they've been marginalized for, since the beginning of this country, but they continue to be even more marginalized or actively cut out of education. I think that museums, especially ones that are telling these particular stories that are being edited out of history right in front of our eyes, they're kind of the last bastions that are protecting these stories and protecting these histories. So for us, the value of just this history being accessible to people, the African American Museum on the Mall is, funded by the federal government. There's, I think, again, real gravity around the existence of that institution. When I was working on that, we were also working on the International African American Museum, which is in Charleston, South Carolina. Mm-hmm. I grew up in South Carolina. I very much so know how much many marginalized communities are treated and their histories are sort of set to the side. When we were sort of working on these at the same time, more than once I got the question, why are there two of these museums?
Mm-hmm.
And it just pissed me off because I was like, why can there only be one? Why shouldn't there be more than one?
Right.
So I think the pure kind of like existence of them means so much for this country. And I think for future generations to have access to these histories, to be able to have intergenerational conversations within their family or, among their peers is so important.
Yeah, 100%. And I'm glad that you touched on that. You're also currently working on the Obama Presidential Center. And I wanted to talk a little bit more about that and exactly what you're overseeing. And I also want to highlight the fact that you open more than 10 award-winning museums since you've started at RIAA. So that's already incredible. And I wanted to highlight that. But let's talk a little bit about the Obama Presidential Center. Can you tell us a little bit more about that and kind of what you're overseeing? When is the completion going to be done?
Let's see. So we started that project early 2017.
Mm-hmm.
Right when he came out of office. So it was a really tough time for this nation. So we're coming close to almost 10 years on the project. The scheduled opening is soft opening probably around spring of next year, 2026, probably going into, I would say, early summer. They don't have official dates yet, but aiming for next year. That project obviously is an honor of a lifetime. Working on the African American Museum in DC. Have you been?
No, I haven't.
The history galleries end with the election of the first African American president, the first Black president, which of course is President Barack Obama. So to open that project and then immediately sort of pick up his story, his narrative, and be working with him and his administration to tell his story was, I think just beyond belief in a lot of ways, that in anyone's career, they would have that privilege to be able to think about that arc of story. For the Obama Presidential Center, what RIA is working on is the museum. So the center itself is going to be an amazing sort of commons space within the south side of Chicago. It's in Jackson Park, and it's going to have not only the museum that we're working on, but really robust kind of civic leadership programming. They're bringing a branch of the Chicago Public Library. They'll have a lot of new activations for the site itself, like sledding, because Chicago has all the snow. I think they're going to be opening a basketball court even sooner than the full campus. So they've really thought holistically about all the amenities and the activations at the center. But RIA, even though we've worked across, I would say, thinking about the visitor journey again across that whole center, our work has really been focused on how to tell his story, his administration story across 2 terms, but working closely with him and his advisors. Of course, he's a humble guy. He doesn't want this museum to be all about him. He wants everyone to feel connected to a larger purpose. And importantly, to do that, I think we have to look back and we also have to look forward in history. So there will be an element of kind of looking back at history. He feels really strongly that, he wouldn't be where he is if he wasn't standing on the shoulders of those who came before him. So that is a really strong thread for visitors. And then the other piece is civics education, which is needed now more than ever.
Oh, yes.
But again, thinking about how can visitors understand the work of President Obama or his administration without understanding how government works. So those are 2 really strong threads, and thinking about how visitors are active participants in society, but also within this experience in the museum.
Yeah, it's really interesting how they're how community based it is, and how they're really how they want to get the community involved across different generations. Which is really interesting. It's not just a presidential center at the end of the day. It's more like a community center for the south side of Chicago.
Yeah.
So you manage, obviously, so many different projects. Can we talk a little bit about some of the biggest challenges of your role at RIA?
Oh, gosh. Okay. I would say I'm going to make it a little bit personal.
Yeah, go for it.
I think as a creative, as a designer, I hope we get to talk about sort of women in leadership
Yes.
and that, 'cause I think there's a lot to sort of unpack there. But I think for me, it's how do I retain that kind of being rooted in the creative aspect of the actual work, while thinking holistically. Like, I think in my role, I'm really sometimes at a certain elevation, but I don't feel like I can be making relevant decisions if I'm not in the work. Of course, I can't be that across all the projects. I'm still very much so involved in the Obama Presidential Center, for example. So I would say on a personal level, I'm still searching for balance between how can I really be rooted in the creativity in the work, but also step back enough to be looking at things sort of across the landscape. And then, of course, the industry itself, kind of watching that and watching the cultural sector. I mean, right now, I think we don't exactly know what's ahead. We're seeing a lot of signs, we're seeing a lot of decisions. And so watching how we can help protect these institutions. So really it's thinking about at a practice level, at a projects level. And then of course, for me at a people level, I think the staff at REA are so important to me. We have such an incredible group of creatives and they're all bringing like incredible different talents to the table. So that cross section of caring for the people, and thinking about the projects and then thinking about the practice is, I would say, challenging, but it's what I love about the role too.
Yeah. But I'm glad that you actually touched on a little bit about women leaders in the field. Can you speak more a little bit about that, being a leader in the design field as a woman and some of the challenges that you might have come across?
Well, it's a systemic issue.
Yes.
So I think there's probably a lot that people have talked about on this podcast before that I would echo. I think for me, it's a lot about how to, and this isn't even specific to REA, it's just navigating through a creative space. It's how to be heard and respected and kind of own your authority and figure out your own leadership style. So obviously I'm answering this from the position I'm in now. I think that sometimes as a female leader, you have to think about the different traditional models of leadership and who has been in those models, which historically mostly have been men. And it's a little bit of a battle, I think, internally to figure out how to lead authentically, because there's the existing model and then there's the opportunity to model a new way of leadership, but also think about how am I going to move the needle and how am I going to make change? So that for me, I think I'm still working through it. I'm still figuring it out. But luckily, I have a really strong network of mentors. And when I think about mentors, I don't think about just sort of the north-south. I think a lot about the east-west, sort of your peers in the field. Luckily, there are more and more women I'm seeing, in leadership positions. So being able to talk to others about any of the challenges you face is really important. Yeah.
And I know you're also a member of the Female Design Council, which do you feel like adds to that part of, speaking with your peers and learning more, especially since they're so related to design, to the design field?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, they have an incredible network. They've been so welcoming, and the range of designers and design thinking at the Female Design Council is really inspiring. And they pull together great events where you can, take your guard down and kind of ask some of those questions from your peers. So absolutely, they're a great organization.
Yeah, I want to take this moment right now to plug the Female Design Council, especially for any woman who is in the design field or even in the art field. They have a really great community of people who support each other. They have events and membership. So really look into them if you are a woman in the field of design or art. Okay, we spoke a little bit about the challenges and all your projects. I wanted now to kind of get a sense of what your favorite part of the job is.
Oh man, there's so many things. I really love the creative work. I love what we were talking about earlier in terms of that first stage of a project, learning so much about each subject matter, engaging in those important and sometimes really hard conversations to help define what the story should be and how people will experience it. I love the end of a project too, where you're kind of seeing it come to life, whether it's the sort of installation in the new building or just testing prototype and seeing how people interact with the ideas. That's sort of at the project level. I think if I'm thinking about the industry and the role of museums, I really appreciate being able to think about how to activate the networks that we have. I feel very fortunate that we've worked with so many different clients. We have so many long-standing clients that are major players in the industry, like the Smithsonian in the States, for example. And so we're able to be at the table in these, cultural moments, these cultural conversations, to think about what is the next step for this industry. And those can be hard conversations. They can be very necessary conversations, like when COVID happened, how are institutions going to react to this? What is the impact that this is going to have for us on the future? So that sort of future thinking is really interesting to me, and how to sort of fold that into our everyday practice. I'm also really appreciative of being a global practice, because every area of the world and every market has a different focus. So we're able to really learn from each other, depending on the kind of conversations that are happening in each of those spaces. So again, that kind of broader thinking, that strategic sort of knitting together how museums are sort of functioning, and how they're serving communities, and what the takeaway is for the visitor is so important to me.
Yeah, 100%. Before we move on to our other questions, I just wanted to ask if recently, at least, have you come across an exhibition design that really floored you, or that you really loved?
Oh, there's so many. Let's see. I draw a lot of my inspiration from fine art. And so maybe this is in the other category of exhibition, but anything that really moves me emotionally, I think, is something that I will end up drawing a lot of inspiration from. Just to say quickly that I think when we're talking about creating didactic spaces, I will answer the inspiration question. When we're thinking about creating these spaces for learning, a lot of it is about the emotional connection, because we know that people will remember if there's an emotional kind of resonance with that story. So I think I'm drawn to more artistic spaces, because often that sort of evocative and compelling components of an art installation is what we try to think about, similar to theater, when we're creating exhibitions. The exhibition that I saw recently at the SF MoMA, it's called The Visitors. Have you heard of this?
Yep.
So you might even be able to describe it better than I have. I've seen it twice. I saw it at the Hirshhorn in DC, and then I came across it recently at the SF MoMA. But it's a series of films in a room. It's a very, very simple installation. I've seen it installed several different ways, but they're large-scale projections, and it's a multi-filmed event of different musicians in different rooms of a house singing a song kind of collectively. And I think it's quite long. It might be close to an hour. But over the course of that time, people are just sort of existing while in harmony, singing together, and then they come together at the end. What I love about it, aside from the sort of emotional qualities of it and the sort of really drawing you into the scenic environments of each of these individual musicians' rooms, is to watch the visitors experience this piece called The Visitors. You can literally see the emotion on their faces, and also they're incredibly active. So I've watched people sort of walk from screen to screen as they would be exploring sort of a home, except they're doing it within this museum environment. And they're really almost unaware of everyone else around them, because they're so caught up in this piece, but they're also at the same time hyper aware that they're in this public setting. So it's a really interesting art piece that I think is really raw, and it's one of the few where I've seen the whole room kind of react in this really authentic way. Did you feel that way when you saw it?
I didn't see it, but I read about it. So I'm glad that you're describing it now and what kind of impact it had on you. That sounds really, really incredible, because I feel like, like you mentioned before, I think a really good exhibition design really evokes an emotion in you that you'll then take away. And that's what you really remember, is how it made you feel. So You are also the editorial advisor. You are also on the editorial advisory board member at the National Association for Museum Exhibitions. Can you tell us a little bit about the National Association for Museum Exhibitions and what it entails to be on the editorial advisory?
Of course, this is one of my I really enjoy being part of this editorial advisory board. I wanted to make a distinction between AAM and then how the journal, which is the editorial piece, is connected to that, because just to do a shout out to the American Alliance of Museums. So they're the only organization that represents the entire museum field in the States, from art to history, museums, science centers, and zoos. They're really taking this like cross-section look. And they bring not only, I would say, the museums themselves, but also the whole kind of ecosystem of the museum industry together. The journal is one of the publications from AAM, and it's a peer-reviewed journal of exhibition theory and practice that's published by that organization. So I believe I've been on that board for a little over 3 years. It's been really interesting to watch it evolve over the time I've been involved. Each issue is based on a theme, and that's, I think, what is interesting to watch from sort of the board level, because the themes are sort of reacting to the larger conversations that are happening within the museum space. So for example, I believe the last one was can exhibitions affect social change? And my role on the editorial advisory board with my board peers is we review and rank submissions of thought pieces for the journal. Of course, they're anonymous when we're reading them, so that we have a non-biased approach to the evaluation. Yep. But it's really interesting to kind of evaluate and get a kind of look into, in a more critical theory way, how people are thinking about these major themes that are impacting the industry and the storytelling and the content of the museum space. So over the course of the year, we're ranking initial submissions, we're reviewing drafts and sending feedback. They do a really wonderful job of thinking about each board member's strengths and sort of point of views to help assign as we get further in the process, the submissions that we're reviewing. And it's a great kind of really wonderful group to be involved with, thinking about how we're putting out these kind of thought pieces.
Yeah. And how did you come to be in this role?
I know that you're going to want to know this about a lot of my things. And I was thinking about this, and I think I just have a wonderful network of friends and colleagues. This one in particular, I can't actually remember. I think I was invited. I'm not sure who passed my name along, but they were looking for a range of, I would say, representation within the industry. I don't think they had many of the sort of exhibit design studio voices as part of the editorial board. So they reached out, and I was really happy to sort of contribute in that space.
You also mentioned just now the thought piece, can museum exhibitions promote social change? Do you think that's possible?
I have to believe it is. I have to believe it is. I think what we were talking about earlier, at this point, it's preserving truth, honestly, and setting that in stone. I think there was a statistic. I would love to see a new poll on this, but I think a few years ago, there was a statistic that said that museums were the second most trusted source of information. The first one was friends and family. So that means it's above journalism, which unfortunately I'm not totally shocked by at this point.
And neither am I.
But I think retaining that is so important. And so just the act of being an accessible place of truth and of respect for research and respect for scholarship is so important. And that, that has to be a foundation for social change. Of course, there's a lot that museums are doing. They're thinking about themselves as hosts. How are they sort of platforms for dialogue for communities? What kind of active programming are they doing to create a sense of belonging or a sense of transparency? And so it's, I think, that layer cake of really important different ways of approaching social change that is so important for these institutions.
Yeah, I 100% agree. And it's interesting how you've mentioned that news and journalism is really no longer the main source of trust amongst people, which I'm not surprised, given the current state of things.
It's unfortunate.
Yeah. Speaking more about your role as a board member, you are also on the national board. You are also a national board member at SEGD. Can you tell us a little bit more about SEGD and what it entails to be a national board member there?
Of course, it's the Society of, used to be environmental graphic design. I think we've pivoted to experiential and graphic design.
Okay.
It is a wonderful organization. I should know how long they've been around, but I don't have it in my back pocket, but certainly for decades. I don't know if you're part, or I'm sure you're following different design organizations. They've really gone through a lot of change, especially over the last 5 years. SEGD has, in the last, I guess, 5 years maybe, a new board, or sorry, not board president, but president and CEO, Sibel Jones. And she has been incredible. She invited me to be on the board. She used to work also at another exhibition design firm and really wanted to bring a range of voices to the board. So the board itself has changed, and I feel like we've done some really exciting things. The role of the organization is really to kind of create community and provide resources to the experiential design field. Formerly kind of thought about as environmental design. And a lot of ways, I think SEGD was one of the first design organizations that were really kind of poking at that space. Now, I think a lot of organizations are pivoting towards that because ultimately, I think experiential design, a lot of design ladders up into that, whether it's graphic design or physical design. So it really can be all encompassing depending on how you're thinking about it. But SEGD has a really kind of robust, beautiful set of programming, both virtual and in-person conferences. We've been able to think about, the future proofing of the organization. We just had a board retreat recently, actually. And
where'd you go?
We went to Detroit, which was really lovely. I hadn't spent time there, and there's really interesting kind of art and community efforts happening there. But someone on the board said that they hope that anyone that needs to find SEGD can find it. And I think that is a really good sentiment of what we prioritize, like creating a space where you can learn but feel like you're part of that industry.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad that we spoke a little bit about them. So moving on to your journey, you are also, and have been for 11 years, the creative director for design, communications, and strategy at Ripple Effect Water Literacy Program, a New Orleans-based environmental education startup company dedicated to K through 12 education on socio-ecological issues of climate change, which we mentioned in your bio earlier. But can you tell us a little bit more about Ripple Effect Water Literacy Project? Because I feel like now we need projects like this more than ever.
Absolutely. Near and dear to my heart, this one. So I actually was one of the founding members. One of my closest friends, Claire Anderson, is the executive director now, but she was one of the co-founders as well. And she was living in New York. She was actually working in the same field that I am now. And I think at one point just had this life pivot moment where she decided she wanted to go into public education. And she wanted to move to New Orleans to do that. And I won't tell her whole life story. She's an amazing human. You should interview her too. But once she was in the space working in K through 4 as a classroom teacher, she really thought about her knowledge of design thinking. She's not a designer, but she's an educator, a brilliant strategist, and just a really authentic human being. And she started to wonder about how design thinking could play a role in the classroom. And it actually originated out of that and working with, we have a lot of overlap in the architecture space, a lot of friends within our network. And the conversation started there. When we started testing some of these design thinking ideas, meaning like using models or different modalities for learning about different subject matters in the space, she quickly realized how climate change education, wasn't being explicitly taught in the schools. So we had I can't remember what grade the student was in, but young, but K through 4, had this moment we were describing that New Orleans was actually a bowl shape, and that's why the water kind of gathered. And there was this light bulb moment for the student, and she was like, "Why hasn't anyone ever told us this before?" And I think that was really a big pivot point in the sort of story of Ripple Effect, because we realize these are our youngest citizens. If they aren't aware, how are they going to have a voice for their communities in this, future that we have handling climate change? So the mission shifted a little bit to how are we able to ensure that even our youngest citizens have kind of ownership over their education and are equipped with the skills they need to be part of the conversation. My role, since I've been, it's been, I think we've been around 14 years now. We're officially a nonprofit 501c3,
Nice.
which is really exciting. And I would say our scope of impact, we're still always, I would say, exploring how we can stay true to our mission, but also be impactful. As you can imagine, there's a lot of water resiliency efforts in New Orleans. So we have stayed true to being in the classroom. We work with a lot of teachers. A lot of our work is just supporting teachers and ensuring that anything we can do to provide their curriculum with some of our research. We work really closely with water experts to help develop our research and some of our curriculum. And for me, being over a decade plus with Ripple Effect, I'm sort of in a 2-part role, thinking strategically about our ongoing work, thinking about our future work, but really Claire is spearheading everything. And then my husband, Chris Hubin, and I have both been in the creative director role. So how does the brand represent us? This is really can be dense and kind of dry content. How do we ensure people feel compelled by it, that they want to invest in it, that they want to help extend our mission? And so the visual representation of that is so important to kind of engage people and communicate the work that we're doing. And so we're working with young designers, working with local designers, and then working with Claire and her team to make sure that we stay true to our mission and our brand expression.
It's so interesting that you kind of went into this like socio-ecological issue, and you mentioned it's near and dear to your heart, and I wanted to talk a little bit more about that, just because I myself am just frightened for the future of every single country, especially when dealing with climate change. And if I hear one more person tell me on social media that climate change isn't real, I'm gonna lose it.
Extreme weather or whatever it was called recently. Yeah.
So I wanted to talk a little bit about why this sort of project is really near and dear to your heart.
I mean, I think it's the biggest crisis that we're facing outside of the ones we're seeing daily in our newsreels. It's hard to maybe prioritize things at this point, but it's here. And, if we're thinking about future generations and their kind of resiliency, I think we have to start with education. I just think we're beyond the point of talking about it in the abstract. And so for us, it's how can we root this thinking in the systems that exist? We think a lot about how to power map to make change, how to work with the systems, how to use our voice. I don't think there's anything more pressing at this point than climate change.
100% agree. How do you manage all of these initiatives, these roles, these projects that you're working on? Like, do you even have like 1 second to breathe?
Well, they give me a lot of energy.
Okay.
I get this question a lot, and I do not have a good answer for it yet, but I really want to have one. I'm really lucky because everything I do, I love. A lot of the initiatives outside of REA that you've mentioned, I consider the people I'm working with friends beyond colleagues. So I think there's an ease there. Like, we are in this mission together, whether it's at the board level or on the ground with Ripple Effect. Of course, my involvement, ebbs and flows. And, I think currently being a little bit more in an advisory role at times is I have to sort of be really clear about what my capacity is. And I encourage everyone to do that and build spaces where we all want to support each other in terms of supporting not going into burnout.
Yeah.
But luckily, I care so much about all of this that it does give me energy. But, I think it's really important that you find space for yourself. Like if I don't have time to let my mind wander, I don't think I'm giving myself the right amount of creative space to be able to contribute to any of these efforts. So looking for that balance is really important. I like to travel a lot. I get to travel a lot for work, which is lovely and exhausting at times, but carving out those moments within all of the work to reflect and to frankly not think is so important. So I try to do that in my daily practice.
Yeah, I always ask that to my guests who have like multiple things going on, because like I have a full-time job. I'm doing this podcast. I also do freelance work and I'm just exhausted all the time. So I'm just like, can you like tell me how to do this?
I don't know. I think it's about your network. Like one of my closest friends who I founded BIPOC Directors Collective with, which she and I joke that we need friendship time to do nothing together, meaning we're just hanging out, we're reading, we're like in the same space, but there's no itinerary for the time. So I think living in this like scheduled, high-paced environment, really thinking intentionally about how you spend the time outside of it is just really important.
Do you ever think about slowing down at some point?
Yeah, or just making sure I have longer stretches of being unplugged. I think everyone says this, but I actually think making sure you truly unplug every so often is really important. It helps you reset. I'm sure any friend or colleague who listens to this is going to say I don't do it enough. But I'm sure at some point I'll find the right time.
Yeah. Well, I hope you do too, because I'm still striving for that myself, honestly. But you briefly just mentioned that you were also the co-founder of the BIPOC Directives Collective. Can you talk just a little bit about that?
Yeah, of course. So that one co-founded with the woman I just mentioned when we were looking for time to do nothing together, but we also spent a lot of time doing a lot together. Anessa Selditz, you should also interview her. She's amazing. We founded BIPOC Directors Collective in 2020 after the murder of George Floyd in the middle of the pandemic. And again, frankly, I think we were just enraged and we were looking at all the anti-racism statements that were being made across all these different industries and really just wanting to say, like, is this real? Are you guys really going to be accountable for this? Yep. What's the plan? And we were looking at, areas that maybe historically have some bad behavior in that space. So areas like architecture and theater and advertising and museums and publishing and design, and thinking about, as directors of color, how can we bring together other directors of color and future directors of color and really imagine the future we want together, but also bring the people in the room who are leaders, who are in conversation around big policy level change, and imagine what that accountability plan might look like. We know that systemic racism doesn't change representation, doesn't change without representation at the leadership level. So that was our first and foremost conversation. We held 2 big conferences over the course of a couple of years, virtual conferences. And the first was really like, what do we need? What needs to change at a high level policy level within these industries? And the second one was looking back. It's been a year. What have we seen change? Those industries that made these commitments, have we seen outcomes? I would say our takeaway from that, which I think I can speak for both of us, was we had, incredible people as part of these conferences and still today part of our network. We were a little shocked that when we brought everyone together for a, kickoff call, prior to the conferences, prior to any of these more public conversations, how much even at that level of, let's say, success or achievement or whatever you want to call it, everyone admires everyone who, was part of this effort that we did. Even those individuals needed just as much support and community as mad as we all were, I think the coming together was the big takeaway for all of us, just the ability to kind of talk through what was happening in the moment. And we just had this realization that it can be really lonely at the top until there's more people there with you. So the evolution of BIPOC DC, we've been a little quiet for a couple of years. We've been thinking about how to learn from that need for community, with the loss of third spaces. I think in our cities and in our communities, we're thinking about how can we maybe look forward to that. But it was, a life-changing moment, I know, for both of us, and we're really grateful we were even able to be, any part of that conversation.
Yeah, I'm so glad that you touched on that, because personally for me, community has always been a really big thing for me, especially a community of women who has supported me, because we've gone through so many of similar things, sadly, in the industry. So I think, having that sense of community and group is really important. So let us now go back a little bit in time to your education, which you touched on briefly in the beginning of the interview. You received a BFA in communication design from Pratt. Why did you end up deciding on Pratt?
I grew up in South Carolina, which I mentioned. And I didn't have any exposure just because of the time and where I was, the locality, to design. My mother and my grandmother were both artists. My mother taught art lessons in our sunroom every year for most of my upbringing there. And so art had always been a huge part of my life. So I knew that I wanted to go into a creative space, but really painting was the only thing that I could kind of imagine moving into. And I also knew that I wanted to be in a big city. I'd always been enamored by this idea of New York, probably whatever I saw in the movies. But being in the South, being a person of color, half Japanese, feeling very othered and kind of looking for different spaces of belonging. I thought maybe being in a place with more people who might look like me was something I really, really was searching for. And frankly, I wasn't, at home, I was incredibly supported, but I think in the school system, I had a pretty tough time. I had several really incredible art teachers, but I also had art teachers that were very traditional. I had my high school guidance counselor. I told her I wanted to go to New York and become an artist. And she said, don't go to New York, and don't go into art. Like, don't go north. Stay in the South and don't go into art because art is fluff. I really viscerally remember this moment in her office. But I also, it made me so mad that I think it gave me this sense of determination. And so I looked in cities. I looked in New York. I looked in Chicago. I think I looked in San Francisco, kind of the big, major art schools or liberal arts programs, and ended up wanting to be in New York. I considered Parsons. Let's see, where else did I look? But I ended up at Pratt. I liked Brooklyn. I liked there's being somewhat of a campus and a community that felt like a good transition for me than just being dropped into the middle of the city. And I think I really liked the real artist studio vibe of Pratt. It was frankly kind of falling apart back when I was there, but in this really kind of beautiful, scrappy way. And I started in painting, and then over the course, the way Pratt works is you have a foundation year and you do a lot of different methods and techniques. So, drawing, painting, of course, sculpture, photography, and that kind of gave me more exposure to possibilities. And ultimately I found graphic design, and I really loved the visual communication of it. And I moved in that direction.
Nice. It's really great that they actually do that, where they make you take a bunch of stuff to see kind of what feels right for you, which I feel like is really critical, honestly, and more schools should be doing that. Is there a piece of advice that you learned in school that you still kind of carry with you till this day? Besides the teacher from South Carolina.
Aside from just follow your dreams, truly. Well, I would say something I'm really grateful to Pratt for is, and this is just my impression. They seem to really, really focus on the conceptual side of the creative thinking. I know other schools might focus maybe on more of the practical side or the business side, which at one point in my career, I was like, I wish I had a little bit more of that because I was sort of trying to learn that on the fly. But I think you can learn that in the business. What you can't learn is the strength of your kind of point of view. And I think Pratt really, really helped you begin to understand that you need to develop a point of view as a creative person and put a lot of emphasis in conceptual thinking. I mean, Ralph Applebaum actually went to Pratt as well. There's sort of a history of Pratt Institute folks at RIA. So I think, staying true to your point of view and continue to develop that over your career is so important.
And how was it finding work post-study? Because I know that one of your earlier jobs was as a graphic designer at Staple Design, but how was it going from school to your first big time job?
I was a pretty nerdy student.
Okay.
I had to force myself to be social. Ended up making like a lot of really wonderful friends. I say that because I was really looking for internships. I was really kind of heads down doing my work. And I actually interned for, I think 2 years at 2 different studios prior to graduating. The last year I was with Staple Design. I ended up extending that work relationship with them before moving on to the field of exhibition design. At Staple Design, I feel very lucky. And it's funny because I think back on that time, and I don't know if I was actively looking for this, but Staple Design is an Asian-owned firm, had a predominantly sort of Asian designers on staff. And in all my interviews, I think I felt most at home immediately there. And I don't think I would have been able to articulate why if you had asked me at that age. But I think I was maybe looking for that. And I think Staple actually helped me recognize my love for more of a multidisciplinary vantage point on design. They have and still have a really kind of incredible approach to their studio. So they have Read Space, which is a retail and art gallery component. And then they have the design studio, and they shared a space back in the day. And their portfolio of work was wide-ranging. So it was everything from fashion to editorial to music. I was designing CD covers, not to date myself. But then, kind of classic graphic design work as well. Didn't do a lot of digital back then. But I really loved thinking about all the different mediums and formats that design could take. It was a really kind of Lower East Side, early 2000s, hip hop, kind of sneakerhead subculture space, which I had so much fun in. But I also, I think it was a moment where I recognized I wanted to maybe look for something that had a broader impact and again, a longer shelf life. So it helped me articulate how I wanted to think about my future in design. But it gave me, such an incredible kind of foundation for thinking. And I'm, forever grateful for that experience.
Were there any sort of projects that you worked on there that you remember fondly?
I worked with on some Nike projects, which was really exciting. Nike historically, and I think they still function in this way, they like to bring on designers who might not be, let's say, like sneakerheads or shoe designers, so that they have really fresh perspectives on thinking about design. So Jeff Eng, who's the founder and executive creative director of Staple Design, has an enormous, incredible shoe collection. And so having Nike as a client was really, really fun for him. And I think they have a really great relationship to this day and still do a lot of work together. But this was early on when the laser printer was invented, and I got to think about patterns and colorways for sneakers and how those could kind of be etched. And, Jeff led with, again, an angle in storytelling. So even the patterns that we were thinking about were wanting to tell a story. So getting to think about that in the form of a shoe was really exciting and a totally different format than I've ever worked in.
That's so cool how you get to essentially work on such wide-ranging projects in your career, from thinking about patterns for sneakers to doing exhibition designs to opening up the Obama Presidential Center. Such a wild.
It's wild.
Yeah.
I don't know. I'm still pinching myself sometimes.
But now we'll head into our final big two questions that I ask everybody. And you already kind of touched on this as a woman leader in the field, but is there anything else that you want to talk about in terms of challenges that you face as a woman in working in the design field?
I think I would just underscore again, in the leadership role, often kind of facing resistance to asserting authority and making creative decisions. It's something I hear all the time from my peers, again, quote unquote, above me or next to me. And of course, people that I'm mentoring myself, this idea of imposter syndrome. And it's something I just want to encourage people to like take up space and own your own creative decisions. But it, sometimes you have to rally yourself to do that. So I think that's the only thing I'd want to underscore again there.
Yeah. And do you have any advice for incoming generations of women who are looking to work in the design field?
I do. And this is the one that I
bring it. Tell me.
I have a lot to say. I actually took some notes on this one because it's so important to me. You just kind of rattled off the great privilege I've had over the course of my career. And I'm not someone who I'm very happy under a rock. So it takes a lot for me to kind of come out and speak about what I care about. But I had a dear friend of mine said, you've been afforded so much opportunity and privilege. You have to kind of hold that door open. So these types of conversations are so important to me because I was very lucky to have mentors in my life who kind of shed a light on the path for me. And it's really important for me to think about the next generation. So I did take some notes because it's so important to me. I have several things I'd love people to remember. I think I touched on this, need to own your own vision and your voice. Develop a strong point of view as early as you can, but also know that it's going to evolve as you grow and as your expertise expands. But, try to stay true to that and really build your point of view. And don't be afraid to share your ideas and advocate for yourself. I've also touched on this, but building a community is so important. So surround yourself with people who, importantly, not only uplift you, but also challenge you. Mm-hmm. I would not be anywhere without the community that I have, both family and chosen family, and friendships and people who work in adjacent spaces or exact similar spaces. So really make sure that you have a strong community and look for mentors and collaborators. You learn so much from everyone else, and being really transparent and sharing your own kind of challenges and successes. You will all learn from each other. Learning the business side, I think, is so important. So that means understand contracts, understand finances, learn about intellectual property, all of those things that are maybe, let's say, the more, the harder side of the work. I can talk a lot about the creative work, but you should learn the business side. And if you're freelancing, make sure you treat yourself like a business, get comfortable with self-promotion and negotiation. Let's see, take risks and experiment. That's really important. So try different mediums, roles, industries. I think you can hear that I have had a very meandering, circuitous path to where I got to today. And so many designers I meet, that my story really resonates with them, because I think you're always searching for that space. So if you don't take risks, if you don't experiment, you're not going to find what you really, really care about. And this is a little cliche, but remember that failure is part of the process. So don't get discouraged by setbacks. Just think of them as learning experiences. I think things like being resilient and persistent are really important. So again, talking about imposter syndrome, make sure that you stay committed to yourself. I think the arts can be a really tough field, but being nimble and being persistent is really important. Just a couple more things.
Yeah, tell me everything. This is great.
Finding your place in the bigger picture. That I think is a lifelong kind of career journey and just personal journey as well. So I think you want to think about, and maybe this is me projecting what I care about a little bit, but how your work contributes to conversations. So for me, I'm thinking about how does my work contribute to culture, to equity, to representation, to social value, a lot of the things we've talked about today. It might be a different list for, anyone else who's listening to this, but I think it's important to, while you on one hand are focusing on the work at hand, you're also thinking about the interconnectedness of your work. And as I've shared today, I think looking across and collaborating across disciplines will really help you think through how to expand your reach and your impact and your point of view. And then I think the last one is really taking care of yourself. You touched on this with, do I want to slow down? How do you really balance that? Burnout is real. So I think you need to set boundaries and prioritize your well-being. You need to make space for inspiration outside of your everyday. So all those initiatives that I told you bring me energy and bring me joy. That is part of taking care of myself. I think creating time to do nothing is really important to really allow your mind to wander. That ultimately is going to kind of keep your creativity alive.
I'm so glad that you touched on all of those because 100% to everything that you just said, especially for me, the failures thing, because as people, we always at least for me personally, I've learned so much more from my failures than I have from my successes. And I think for me, because I'm such a perfectionist, I always remember everything that goes wrong and how I can improve it and change from it, which is, we should celebrate our successes. That would be the highlight. But, I have taken away so much from that. And just to not be discouraged, because it's so easy once you mess something up to be like, you know what, I'm never going to try this again, or this isn't for me. Just have at it a couple more times before you really go, you know what, this really isn't for me.
Yeah. Yeah. But I guess one thing I also want to say is recognize how hard you've worked.
Yeah.
I'm going to name drop for one
Go
second,
for it.
which is I was at an event with Shonda Rhimes, which I could not believe I was there.
God, I love her.
She's amazing. She's talk about modeling.
I know.
Amazing leadership. We were having a glass of wine, maybe a couple. And, she was asking me some of the questions you're asking me today, just how, what was my path to get here? And I think I started my story with something around, I'm so lucky to XYZ. And she interrupted me and stopped me in my tracks and said, never say you're lucky. You've earned where you are. You have to own that. And it really, really stuck with me. And it made me realize how I, tend to present myself. And I think if we think about modeling ourselves as leaders, the words I choose are so important for myself, but also for, what people hear from me.
You know what? It's so crazy that you mentioned that story because now I'm racking my brain trying to think of any time if I've ever actually heard a male counterpart say, I'm so lucky or I'm so fortunate.
Totally.
Or, underscore their privilege into being where they are now. It's always women who really start conversations like that.
Only those men who have women like us in their lives.
Exactly.
Exactly.
But thank you so much for sharing that. That was so many words of wisdom.
So many words.
Which I absolutely love because I feel like future generations really need to hear those things. I wish I did when I was younger.
I know. If she had told me that 20 years ago, I don't know who it would have been. Shonda 2028.
Yep. I wish. But I think we have time for maybe 2 fire round questions.
Okay.
So I have 10 questions here, but I'll ask you to pick a number between 1 and 10 and then I'll read the corresponding question.
Ooh.
To go for it. Tell me your number.
Number 4.
4. What is a passion project you want to complete?
Ooh. Well, I would love to pick up, oh man, there's so many. I think you're getting this from me. I would love to pick up where we sort of left off with BIPOC DC, Directors Collective, to think about how to create a space for community and belonging. We've talked a lot about third spaces when we're kind of brainstorming this. We joke about communes. Maybe we're not joking at this point. But I'd love to focus on a project that is about creativity and joy. Not that I don't have that, but I think there's a lot of heaviness with a lot of the work that I do. And so a lot of what I've been thinking about is imagination and beauty and joy and all of that can relate to a sense of belonging and community. So I don't know what that is yet, but it's something I've been talking a lot about with my peers and friends. So hoping there's something coming that's kind of shaping that into an effort.
Well, I'm going to manifest that for you.
Thank you.
Okay, one more question. Pick a number.
3.
3. If you could talk to anyone dead or alive, who would it be besides Shonda?
Besides Shonda. Oh gosh, the list is long. This is a totally weird one.
Go for it. I mean, this is like, these are questions for just up the top of your head.
Only because, yeah, this is a weird one, but I'm going to say it. Gertrude Stein.
Okay.
Because I
love
think
that.
because in line with the previous question, actually, she hosted these salons in her Paris apartment, and I've been thinking about the like resurrection of that concept of a salon. Like my husband and I, who's also a designer, have been thinking about starting to host these salons where we critique constructive criticism, young designers' work or emerging designers' work. And we come, I love hosting, I love cooking. And so maybe hosting a big salon dinner and bringing different creatives from different spaces to just look at work and kind of get excited about work and art and design together again. So I would love to hear like what inspired her to do that and the format. And I've been researching a lot about her salon. So just right now tied to my passion project.
That's fantastic because I feel like people are most people are scared to be really honest about things. And I feel like that actually hinders people in the long run. Like I value honesty when people tell me like, this isn't working or you need to fix like constructive criticism because that really also like, you know, impacts my creativity as well. Like maybe pivoting somewhere where I wouldn't normally go. So I really appreciate that. So I think that would be great.
Yeah. I'm excited.
Well, thank you for being here. Thank you for sharing everything.
Thank you.
I really enjoyed our chat.
Me too.
And yes, thank you for everything.
Well, thank you for doing this podcast. It's great to see a podcast focused on women and shifting the needle a little bit. And it's just been a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And to all my listeners, thank you for tuning in again. And I will see you guys next week. Bye.